we're really finding ourselves in an interdependent world. And if we agree that it's truly interdependence, then we have to agree with you that this needs more collaboration, more interaction, especially at the global level, but also the local level. While I say a few words of introduction about our next keynote speaker, my colleague is just assisting with the microphone transition. It's a very high honor for me to have the chance to introduce the keynote speaker, the Honorable Mr. Saeed W. Musa, who I think may have traveled the furthest to come to this conference. We were discussing yesterday that maybe we made a mistake by bringing him here. We should have actually gone to Belize instead, where the temperatures and the sunshine are clearly much better than Berlin today. But allow me to say a few words of introduction about the Honorable Mr. Saeed W. Musa. Mr. Musa served as Circuit Magistrate and later Crown Counsel in the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions in Belize before entering the private practice in 1970. He was appointed Senator in 1974 and served in that capacity until 1979. He was then elected a member of the House of Representatives for the Fort George Division from 1979 until 1984. And served as Attorney General and Minister of Economic Development. He assisted in the drafting of the Belize Independence Constitution in 1981. Mr. Musa has served in various capacities, including Belize's governor of the Caribbean Development Bank and the IBRD, World Bank. During the period of 1989 to 1993, he served as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Education, and Sports. In 1996, he was elected leader of the People's United Party and led the party to a landslide victory in general elections in 1998. He was then re-elected to serve as Prime Minister for a second 5-year term from 2003 until 2008. Mr. Musa still serves as an elected member of the House of Representatives, having been re-elected on March 7, 2012, to his 7th term as a Member of Parliament representing the Fort George constituency of Belize City. So really tremendous experience at the local, national, and international level for Belize. We're very, very grateful to have you here. The lecture topic that Mr. Musa has chosen, Overcoming Structural Barriers to Growth with Equity in Small Developing Countries, Perspectives from Belize. If you could please join me in a very, very warm welcome for the Honorable Mr. Saeed Musa. Thank you.
Good morning. Many of us were taught at school that during the Middle Ages, there was little or no economic improvement over some 8 centuries. Then came the Industrial Revolution, when incomes consistently advanced at a rate that was extraordinary by any former historical standard. We were then told to draw the conclusion that technical advance was the origin of economic growth, and that it was in fact the central, if not the sole cause of the Industrial Revolution. Since then, some economists have argued that inventions in and of themselves are not the sole or even the leading source of prosperity. Technological innovation is necessary to growth, but it is as much a consequence of economic opportunities as it is their cause. As the argument goes, it is the growth of markets through trade, colonization, and domestic expansion that is the predominant factor in Western economic development. The growth of markets was closely associated with the rapid flow and dissemination of information, which was typically a byproduct of expanding markets and innovation. The colonization of African, Caribbean, Latin American, and Pacific territories by Western powers provided significant sources of cheap raw materials and basic commodities for the growing markets and factories in the metropolitan centers of Europe. The mass extermination of indigenous people and the inhumanity and abomination of the slave trade that accompanied imperialism and colonialism stand out as dark clouds in the evolutionary landscape of capitalism, which reappear ever so often in modern times whenever man's inhumanity to man rears its ugly head. The poetic writings of Eduardo Galeano in his book Open Veins of Latin America, the seminal work of Dr. Eric Williams a former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, in his book From Columbus to Castro, and the penetrating analysis of how Europe underdeveloped Africa by the late Guyanese Professor Walter Rodney, provide powerful insights into this sordid period of history. But the expansion of markets through trade and colonization with the spread of information were not sufficient factors for sustainable growth and development. Our understanding of why countries and economies grew is because they were able to attain basic thresholds in several key areas. These include democratic governance, order, peace, and political stability, literacy, educational attainment and health of the population, the distribution of income-making assets, the availability of financial capital, the development of legal institutions, and the vitality of entrepreneurialism. Most of these key areas are necessary conditions for sustainable growth, but no one of them is sufficient in itself. The abundance of natural resources is certainly a blessing, but as history shows, it can also be a curse. An equally important factor is the human instinct to improve one's material well-being. It has been said that the first human material motivation is to acquire food and shelter. The second seems to be security. The third is apparently power and pleasure, including recreation and other aspects of enjoyment. The fourth is all the complex issues of status and identity. The instinct to improve oneself materially is necessary for growth. It is at the fountain of the enterprising spirit which drives private enterprise. But as Amartya Sen, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, reminds us in his book, Development as Freedom, it is important to dispute the common description of Adam Smith, as we were told yesterday, the father of modern economics, as the single-minded prophet of self-interest. Smith did point out that the motivation for mutually beneficial exchanges does not need more than what he called self-love. But he also noted that in dealing with other economic issues, like the rules to be followed for generating productive efficiency, the virtues of prudence, humanity, generosity, and public spirit are the qualities most useful, end of quote. The profit motive leads far too easily to individualism, selfishness, and greed. Furthermore, one's basic motivation for self-improvement has often been undermined by despair, humiliation, poverty, and tyranny. In my statement, I then go on to speak about that growth in GDP is not enough. Indeed, no budget speech by a finance minister is ever complete without mentioning the rate of growth of the gross domestic product of the nation. But GDP by no means provides all the information about how well off we are. When the GDP grows faster, so do incomes on average, generally. Does not, however, measure the nation's total wealth, its assets such as land, housing, stocks, etc., as opposed to the annual volume of goods and services made and provided. Of course, I'm preaching to the converted. You're all economic students. Huh? It does not account for the degradation of the environment when a hurricane devastates the coastline of a small Caribbean nation and destroys its physical infrastructure and the poorly constructed homes of low-income families. In fact, GDP usually increases because more money is spent to rebuild damaged high-end dwellings and hotels. And the GDP does not tell us how the nation's total income is distributed among workers. Higher income workers usually get most of what the nation produces, as has been the case since the late 1970s in particular. The recent Occupy Wall Street protest movement demonstrates a widespread dissatisfaction with the growing economic inequality in our world today. This is not simply one of the divide between the rich and the poor countries, but also inequality among individuals, groups within societies, both rich and poor. As we've heard earlier today, the 21st century opened with an unprecedented declaration of solidarity and determination to rid the world of poverty. In the year 2000, the United Nations Millennium Declaration, adopted by the largest ever gathering of state and government, committed countries, rich and poor, to doing all they can to eradicate poverty, promote human dignity and equality, and achieve peace, democracy, and environmental sustainability. The historical record showed that economic growth was a powerful force for pulling poor people above the income poverty line, but that such gains did not automatically happen. Furthermore, these gains can be dissipated if income inequality widens and poor people do not share adequately in growth, a phenomenon observed in many countries in recent years. Over the past 2 decades, income inequality worsened in 33 of 66 developing countries, according to a UNDP report. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate for economics in 2002, has written challenging the received wisdom that there is a systematic relationship between globalization and growth, and between growth and poverty reduction. He debunked what he called, quote, long discredited trickle-down economics, which hold that a rising tide lifts all boats. Neither theory nor evidence, he says, supports the view that opening markets to short-term speculative capital flows increases economic growth. Rather, there is a considerable evidence and thought that it increases economic instability, and that economic instability contributes to insecurity and poverty. And even if growth increased slightly, the form of it might increase poverty, especially in countries without adequate social safety nets. His conclusion is that globalization, as it has been practiced, is unfair, and its benefits have disproportionately gone to rich corporations and the wealthy elite. And I think we can all agree with that. The debate should be on how globalization can be shaped, including the rules of the game, to better promote growth and reduce poverty in the developing world. For as Jeffrey Sachs tells us, the defining challenge of the 21st century will be to face the reality that humanity shares a common fate on a crowded planet. I go on to argue that a rising tide does not lift all boats. We in the small developing countries are beginning to understand that our citizens share a common fate, requiring the active role of government to ensure that every citizen has a chance and means to participate productively within the society, and to curb society's dangerous encroachment on the physical environment. The market economy operates in most, if not all, our countries, but market forces left to themselves will not deliver sustained and equitable economic growth without the guiding hand of overarching principles of social justice and environmental stewardship. What we can discern from all the studies, and including that of Paul Collier, a professor of economics at Oxford University, whose study was focused on African countries, and he speaks about the bottom billion, a group of about 50 failing states, caught in various poverty traps, which include civil war and corrupt governance. And even in those countries which may be rich in natural resources like oil, this blessing often becomes a resource curse, resulting in deepening poverty and inequality. Cost of living skyrockets. The government indulges in wasteful spending. The politics of patronage, cronyism, and nepotism soon shatters the growth and development of the nation. From all these studies, we can discern that poverty and growing inequality is an outcome of more than economic policies. It is an outcome of the failure of political will and capacity to address the human development of a people through policies that promote economic growth with equity. It is an outcome of the inability or powerlessness of a people to take charge of their own lives, to demand and to pursue the social programs and actions that promote opportunity and enhance their security. There is also the crucial and complex role that culture plays in this process. David Landis, in his book entitled The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, contends that the key factor in explaining why some countries are able to make the leap forward to development and others are not is the cultural endowments of its people, particularly the values of hard work, thrift, honesty, and tenacity, as well as the degree to which it is open to change and to new technology. The beliefs and practices that are part of local culture can no doubt be a source of sustainable development, but too often customary practices and discrimination on the basis of gender, ethnicity, race, religion, social status, or class are the root causes of pervasive inequality in many countries. We have seen from history how racism in the United States of America and many countries in Latin America have led to deeply divided and unequal societies. The extreme poverty of the indigenous Maya and Quechua people, majority of the population in the Central American nation of Guatemala, can only be explained by decades of repression and social marginalization. Under a latifundista system, where most of the arable land was owned and controlled by the wealthy and the powerful, the vast majority of the people were left to eke out a living as subsistent peasant farmers in poor rural communities, lacking even basic health and education facilities, potable water systems, or electricity. Meanwhile, right next door, and I'm not beating my chest here, in Little Belize, a major land reform program was initiated by the government of the then Premier, George Price, which transformed the country and greatly reduced the inequality between rural communities and urban residents. In 1990, a new approach was introduced to assess the development of nations by putting the condition of people and their quality of life at center stage. UNDP reports began measuring human development by national income, GDP, but also by life expectancy and literacy. The central contention of the human development approach is that well-being is much more than about money. It is about the possibilities that people have to fulfill their life plans they have, to reason, to choose, and to pursue. The plans they have and reason they choose to pursue. The human development approach emphasizes empowerment, equality, and sustainability in expanding people's choices, people's freedoms, and capabilities to lead lives that they value. We are talking here about the freedoms to live long, healthy, and creative lives, to advance other goals, and to find fulfillment in doing so. Both equity and sustainability are really about distributive justice. Inequalities are especially unjust when they systematically disadvantage specific groups of people, whether because of gender, ethnicity, or birthplace, or when the gap is so great that acute poverty is high. The current generation destroying the environment for future generations is no different from a present day's group suppressing the aspirations of other groups for equal opportunities to jobs, health, or education. It is a fact that most people today live longer, are more educated, and have more access to goods and services than ever before. But income inequality has deteriorated in many countries and regions. Over the last decade or so, several Latin American countries have bucked this trend. Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Peru as examples. Others in the Caribbean and Central America have experienced growing inequality, even with a level of economic growth. Turning to the small developing countries like Belize, most of the countries in this region, with the exception of Haiti, are considered medium human development nations. Several, Barbados, Costa Rica, Bahamas, Cuba, Panama, Trinidad and Tobago, are even classified as high human development nations. Yet, in most, if not all these developing countries, there is persistent poverty, deep-seated pockets of extreme poverty, and gross income inequality. Belize is a young nation. Political independence from Britain, as you've heard, was achieved only 30 years ago, in 1981. Belize began life as an independent country ranked 22nd in terms of GDP per head among the countries of the Caribbean, indicating the long distance that Belize needed to travel. Independence did entitle us to certain preferential trade agreements, like NAFTA, well, not like NAFTA, like CBI. In fact, when NAFTA came along, involving Mexico, the US, and Canada, that pretty much dissipated the benefits of CBI for us. And in the case of Europe, we have the original Lomé Convention, which defined the terms of exports between ACP, African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, and the European community. Lomé is now transformed into the EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements. These trading arrangements are indeed important to small developing countries, who all need to become competitive in the products they export and diversify into others. But the fact remains that trade policies in the rich, industrialized countries remain highly discriminatory against the products of the poor, especially the agriculture-based small developing countries. Protection is in most rich countries remain extremely high through a variety of instruments, such as high tariffs for agricultural goods, import quotas. Another one is, of course, the large subsidies that they pay for their domestic food producers. Again, in the field of technology, there have been dramatic advances in medicine, agriculture, energy, information, and communications technology, offering huge opportunities to put the power of technology to work for development by raising productivity. Many rich countries, however, despite their commitment in the so-called trade-related aspects of intellectual property, the TRIPS, they have taken no real steps to share their technology. A recent study done by Victor Bulmer Thomas and his wife Barbara Thomas, entitled The Economic History of Belize, shows that the fluctuations in the growth of the Belizean economy since independence have several causes, but the most volatile has been investment, both private and public. In Belize, the government has been responsible on average for a high share of this investment since independence, around 40%. Since high public investments in boom years is normally financed by borrowing from abroad, it has led to a problem of external indebtedness, with the central government struggling to service the debt in slump years. Recently, the private investment climate has been jolted by the government's takeover of the main telecommunications provider and the National Electricity Company. Taking over these private companies in the name of nationalizing Belizean public utilities offered the government both immediate financial and political benefits. Financial because the profits accrue to the revenue base of public finances, while the compensation due to the original foreign investors remains unpaid, tied up in litigation. Political because of its nationalistic stirrings in the hearts and minds of the population. It brought them some political advantage. The long-term costs to the country, however, may be harder to calculate, for there is no doubt that this nationalization has put a very serious damper on the already dismal level of foreign investment in Belize. The millions of dollars that will have to be paid as compensation is putting a severe strain on this government's ability to service its debt obligations. The social sector, health services, education, etc., is facing further cuts. Public officers, teachers, nurses, and police have had their wages frozen. The gap between the have and the have-not have worsened. For instance, at the time of independence, the people of Belize were all relatively poor. There was a lack of extremes between the rich and the poor. Ostentatious wealth was not flaunted even by the few well-to-do merchants, landlords, and business people. Conspicuous consumption was virtually absent. But 20 years later, we find that the poverty level has increased to today at 41.6%, with 16% being extreme poverty. In the Caribbean, only Haiti and the Dominican Republic had higher levels of poverty. Other factors that affected our growth with equity, I can mention quickly, were of course the storms, the hurricanes that we've suffered. For instance, between 1998 and 2007, Belize sustained extensive damage and destruction from at least 5 storms and hurricanes. And as a result, a lot of borrowing had to take place. Our government, through a homegrown adjustment program of increased taxes and cuts in capital expenditure, we were able to reduce the fiscal deficit from 8% of GDP in 2004 to less than 1% of GDP in 2008. We also successfully carried out a debt restructuring of virtually 100% of our commercial foreign debt. But this tough austerity program, although successful fiscally, it took its toll politically when our government was trounced and voted out of office in 2008. Deficit reduction was, of course, the right thing to do. But looking back, I can say that the pace of implementation may have been too rapid, resulting in much hardship, especially on the working poor and the middle class. If I can sum up then, I do need to mention another debilitating phenomenon which is affecting developing countries. And this is the growing phenomenon of crime and violence. This has a tremendous effect on our whole growth pattern and development. It is something that will require far more detailed study and analysis of what is going on in these countries, particularly countries in our region, which is affected by the transshipment of drugs, particularly cocaine, from South America to North America. And this cost of crime and violence falls disproportionately on poor and marginalized people. To summarize then, if I can sum up, I would like to leave you with the following thoughts. 1, economic growth and wealth creation are important and necessary means to fight poverty and to provide a better quality of life for all the people. 2, there is no one model of development for all countries. Pathways to advancing human development are varied and specific to the country's historical, political, and institutional conditions. 3, private sector investment, local and foreign, is crucial. 4, the economic growth may not translate into equitable growth unless there is democratic governance that provides transparency and accountability by the public officials and institutions, the rule of law, open government, independent judiciary, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And I will also make the point that even though we are democratic in name, we have free and fair elections, usually, but democracy does not guarantee freedom and justice. For example, freedom of the press and freedom of information may be proclaimed in the Constitution and in the Freedom of Information Act, but the government has been better at rhetoric than reality. Sunlight, wrote Louis Brandeis, a Supreme Court judge, nearly a century ago, is said to be the best disinfectant. 5, the most powerful weapon to breaking down this wall of political, social, and economic injustice and discrimination is education. I certainly believe in that. Investment in education that provides universal access to quality and relevant education is the key to poverty elimination. 6, I make the point that an education that inspires young people to participate productively in society must confront head-on the reality of the present generation that seems totally obsessed with the culture of materialism and instant gratification. 7, the mind is a terrible thing to waste, but so too is the body and the spirit of a whole generation. A healthy population is essential for people to live long, productive lives. And indeed, the growing gap between the rich and the poor is dangerous in countless ways. And 7, some problems are beyond the capacity of individual states, particularly small states, to deal with effectively. And we do need the support and assistance, as Dr. Prunk has been talking about this morning. In addition, there are certain global issues, such as migration, climate change, and natural disaster relief, which absolutely require the attention and financial support of the international community. In the final analysis, I believe, finally in conclusion, that it is not only in our enlightened self-interest, but as citizens living in a community to find the maximum outlet for our creative energies and human potential, to understand the plight of the poor, the dispossessed, the young people without hope, and to share in the responsibility of reshaping our world by doing all that we can to end the exploitation of one human being by another. Our common humanity demands this of us. The urgent demand of our generation is to reduce the widening gap in income inequality and to break down the barriers to growth with equity in our economic, social, and political life. Ending extreme poverty and inequality is the moral imperative and the great opportunity of our time. It is an undertaking that will relieve great suffering and spread economic well-being, thus expanding the reach of human freedom. It will be a fulfillment of the sacred promise in our nation's constitution, wherein we, the people, affirm that the nation of Belize shall be founded upon principles which acknowledge, quote, the dignity of the human person and the equal and inalienable rights with which all members of the human family are endowed by their Creator. Thank you.